Okay, this is the conclusion from this morning service. This morning we saw David's deliverance from despair, and that was found in Psalms 143. And we saw his complaint, his constraint, and his conquest. Here is his conclusion. It's in the last verse of our passage, Psalms 143. Look at verse 12. He says, "And of thy mercy cut off mine enemies, and destroy all them that afflict my soul, for I am thy servant." Now there's where we got to get to. I'm your servant. The conclusion is this: you're either the devil's slave or you're God's servant, and the two are not the same. A slave and a servant are not the same. Now, America knew that and understood that when they used the Bible. But when they got away from the Bible, they lost their mind. And I'm going to show it to you. Jeremiah chapter 2. Jeremiah 2, verse 13. He says, "For my people have committed two evils. They have forsaken me, the fountain of living waters, and hewn them out cisterns, broken cisterns that can hold no water. Is Israel a servant?" Number one question. Is he a homeborn slave? Second question. Why is he spoiled? Look down at verse 17. "Hast thou not procured this unto thyself, in that thou hast forsaken the Lord thy God when he led thee by the way?" So they chose what they were. Now I'm going to read you somebody else's information here. This is not mine, but it's good stuff. This is an excerpt of it. I can't read you everything he wrote. His name is Dr. John M. Ashquith. He says, "Servant and slave are two distinctly different words. They do not mean the same thing. The ESV uses the word slave many times to replace the word servant." Jeremiah asked two distinctly different questions. The first he wanted to know is if Israel was a servant. Second, he asked if Israel was a homeborn slave. What's the difference? The Oxford English Dictionary of the 16th century defines it this way: one who is the property of or entirely subject to another person, whether by capture or purchase or birth, completely divested of freedom and personal rights. That's a slave. He has no rights. This is in contrast to a servant who has rights. A servant does have rights. Now, not as many as a free man, but a servant has rights. This is the definition, Oxford definition of a servant: one who is under the obligation to render certain services due. Now, as a kid, you know you had some obligations you shirked. Okay, so a slave is different than a servant in that a servant is just obligated to do these things. He may or may not. He does have still some rights still. And to obey the orders of a person or body of persons, especially in return for wages or for salary. So, let's think about it. If you're doing your service for wages or salary, and that makes you a servant, not a slave. Now, a slave is considered less than a person, less than human. So therefore, they have no rights. Now, that's where the big thing comes in. The first question, Jeremiah wondered if Israel was reduced to working for others. Is he a servant? In the second one, he asked if Israel's lost all his rights and reduced to involuntary service. Somebody just walks out. Rome had the power to enslave anybody. Not servant, but slave. For instance, if they were walking down, a soldier was walking down the road and they saw somebody else, they could say, "Hey, give me your coat." Jesus says, "Give him your cloak also." That's a slave. He just has to do. He doesn't have any choice in the matter. They could compel someone to carry another person's cross. We read about that in the story of Jesus. Okay, that's servanthood because they don't get a choice. In the ESV, they ask the same thing twice in order to confuse the terms servant and slave. Well, that's misleading. The implication of being a homeborn slave is that he was born into servitude. He was a slave there was a slave who had a child, and now that child is the property of the owner as well. The NIV reduces the two questions to one question, and so doing defines servant as a homeborn slave. It says this: Israel a servant, a slave by birth, as though the two are the same, but they're not. Now he's going to go back and quote you some information from a book written in 1840. Hildreth's work called The Despotism in America. And this is all about slavery. Well, one section of it is. He explains how biblical Christianity rolled into the English common law and freed the slaves in Massachusetts. The passages that common law courts used to free slaves is this one. Exodus 21 verse 1 says this: Now these are the judgments which thou shalt set before them. If thou buy an Hebrew servant, 6 years shall he serve, and in the 7th he shall go out free for nothing. That is, he gets to leave after 7 years. Okay, so a Hebrew purchased under the Mosaic law could not be held in bondage for more than 7 years. That was the max of his contract. He was a contract employee. He retained the right of freedom after 7 years. The English court had applied all rulings between Hebrews and the Mosaic law to interactions between Christians. That was England's decision. Therefore, under the common law, a Christian could not own a Christian for more than 7 years. And of course, they used the word Christian very loosely. They would say that England was a Christian nation. You know, the Church of England? Okay, they say that's Christian. They would say America is Christian. They would even say Rome was Christian. That's the world. The world thinks a Catholic's a Christian, whatever. We can't get into that right now. When Massachusetts wrote its first constitution during the American War for Independence, they could not muster the votes needed to ban slavery. They couldn't do it. But John Adams wrote in 1790 there was not a slave left in Massachusetts because of the Constitution. Hildreth explains that this was accomplished by slaves suing for their freedom in common law court. In common law, ruling made prior to American independence, they allowed for this to happen because they were recognizing them not as a slave, but as a servant. A slave doesn't have the right to sue. So, just by virtue of them being able to walk into a courthouse to sue, meant they were not a slave. So that in and of itself voided out the wording. The whole idea of indentured servitude came from Exodus, the passage we read, 21, verse 1 and 2. A poor person in Europe could sell himself and his family to a sea captain who would sell him in turn to another family or a farmer in America. That's happened all the way down through history. Now that's different than man-stealers. Because there's another group of people that go over to Africa and steal people. Those are slaves. They didn't get a choice in the matter. Now the Bible forbids that from the beginning. No man-stealer. After 7 years, the common law dictates that the family is now free. Many people researched their genealogies and realized, hey, we came over because great-great-grand whoever indentured themselves to pay off a debt or to gain money, or, the economy died and they had to go work for somebody. And now we've just perpetuated because we were born into that and they keep putting us in slavery. They go into the court and say, here's the proof where this all started. None of us are slaves. We're actually servants. A servant goes free after 7 years. The revolution in Massachusetts happened because slaves were proved that by common law and by the Bible they were not slaves. They were servants and incapable of being held longer than 7 years. How fortunate for them that there was no ESV or NIV. Otherwise, the wordings would have been the same. The ESV said this in Exodus 21:2. When you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years, and in the 7th year shall he go out free for nothing. Okay, now they've left it up to you to decide if you're going to let him go. Because remember, slave has no rights. And in order to get a slave, he has to be forced into it. Now it's okay to be a man-stealer. The Bible doesn't contradict itself. Even though he's going out free, his status was still called a slave, according to, we're going to use the ESV. And he has no rights. No such person could have sued in the court of law because he didn't have the right to sue. What Hendrich described was the use of Roman law. Now, he's very non-biblical law. The laws in America and England were based on one thing: the Levitical Mosaic law. That's where they went to get what law is, and that's correct. That's God gives the law. So, all that a person had to do was run back to the Bible and prove what the Bible said. And now they were free under the law. Those states that retained slavery into the 19th century did so by overriding the common law. They did that by running to Rome. The way Rome set up its laws was this: we'll have a group of people who decide what we do or don't do. You know, the hotbed for corruption. Basically what goes on in Congress and Senate right now. Who's going to pay me the most and pad my pocket? And I'll put this little rider on the bill, and, we'll all that stuff that's going on, rather than biblical mandate by God. The only other time our King James Bible uses the word slave is in Revelation. So, according to the Bible, they're servants. How long do you keep a servant? 7 years, okay? They're not slaves. But somebody's got slaves. Look at it in Revelation chapter 18. Revelation 18, verse 11. Revelation 18, 11 to 13. He says, "And the merchants of the earth shall weep and mourn over her. For no man buyeth their merchandise any more, the merchandise of gold and silver and precious stones, of pearls, of fine linen, purple and silk and scarlet, and all thine wood, and all manner of vessels of ivory, and all manner of vessels of precious wood, of brass, of iron, of marble, and cinnamon, and odors, and ointments, and frankincense, and wine, and oil, and fine flour, and wheat, and beasts, and sheep, and horses, and chariots, and what? Slaves, and souls of men." You know what the devil does? He enslaves a person. Did you have a choice when you were born into this world whether or not you were going to be a Christian or a lost man? For as by one man sin entered into the world, and death by sin. You don't get a choice in the matter. You're a slave to sin. The devil has slaves. God doesn't have slaves. He has servants. You choose. I want to serve him. Now, obviously here in the end times, when the Holy Spirit has taken the bride of Christ out of here and the devil gets to have his heyday, things are going to go so bad, it's going to be a Muslim-run world at that point. And devil-run. Devil-run through Muslims. That's a Muslim practice. One of the principal ways of doing this is to confuse people so they don't know the difference between slave and servant. So we confuse the Word of God, and then we can enslave humans. That's what the devil's always wanted to do. He started it all the way back in Genesis chapter 3. And way before that. Okay, one other passage. Isaiah chapter 50. That's the end of our excerpt. There's more there, and it's all good stuff, but I just don't have time to read it all. Isaiah chapter 50, verse 1. Isaiah 50, verse 1. Thus saith the Lord. Who's he talking to? Israel. Thus saith the Lord, where is the bill of your mother's divorcement? Whom have I put away? Or which of my creditors is it to whom I have sold you? Behold, for your iniquities ye have sold yourselves, and for your transgressions is your mother put away. You know what Israel did? As a nation, they sold themselves into servitude to the devil. And just like the contract for a servant, he's going to have to serve. Israel will. You know when his service will begin? The second we leave, probably. That'll be the tribulation. You know how long he's going to have to be in servitude? 7 years. Because that's what a servant has to serve. 7 years. But the good news on the backside of it is, after 7 years, he's going to be free, and freer than he'd ever even imagined.